So I'm Brad Jensen, and I'm going to talk about some work with Lori Klutzer. We have a policy brief that's included in your folder. It's hot off the press, just released today. I hope that my comments now, while brief, will help you understand what we've written about and encourage you to take a look at it. So we agree with Alan that this is an important issue, and predicting it is a difficult task, made more difficult by kind of the lack of data on the service sector in this country. So people who are trying to get a sense of what the potential impact might be are left to be creative in creating ways to identify what's tradable and what's not. So I'm going to talk about a different methodology than what Alan described that's based on actual trading patterns within the United States. I'll then go on and take our estimate of how many jobs are potentially tradable. They can be provided at a distance, and look at the risks of import competition or offshoring. How many of those jobs are likely to go or face contestability, in Alan's words. Then I'd like to highlight an issue that I think is often missing from this conversation about offshoring, which is opportunities from service exports. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about how these tradable jobs, what they look like, and what it means for what jobs might be lost and what jobs might be gained. I'll talk about the potential labor market impact and also present very briefly numbers on impact to date. I'll wrap up with some very brief implications. So in terms of highlights, we find that many service activities are traded within the United States and thus tradable, at least potentially tradable internationally. We estimate 40% of employment in the United States is in industries that we classify as tradable. So that's a big number. In fact, there are more workers in services, in tradable services, than in tradable manufacturing. So we don't mean to minimize the potential scope of trade and services to affect the U.S. labor market. However, these jobs, these tradable service jobs, have very different characteristics than non-tradable service jobs or even than manufacturing jobs. And this is important to understanding how trade and services is going to influence the U.S. job market. These tradable service jobs are very high skill, high wage jobs. Because of that, we expect that less than half of the jobs that we classify as tradable are going to face any risk of being offshored to low-wage, labor-abundant countries. This is key, and I hope I'll explain it more later, but this is key. With almost half of those jobs being in the manufacturing sector, which has long been considered at risk to offshoring. Because these tradable services are high wage and high skill, we expect the U.S. to gain jobs from service exports. These jobs are consistent with U.S. comparative advantage. We expect to gain jobs as a result. Last, trade and services is not yet, in contrast to what Alan suggested, we don't find that trade and services has had a measurable impact on the U.S. labor market. So let me first talk about how we define tradable services. So the intuition is pretty simple. What we're going to do is, when you think about these jobs that require face-to-face interaction, or what Alan called in his article in Foreign Affairs, personal services, where you need to be physically present to provide it. A lot of those jobs, think barbershops, think daycare for your kids, think grocery stores. You need to be physically present to do it. Those jobs are pretty evenly distributed with population in the United States. So a region's share of the grocery store industry is equal to its share of the overall labor force. In contrast, there are activities, so here I put up Seattle's share of employment in a number of key sectors. So what you see is Seattle, which is the home to Boeing, has 9 times its share of the aircraft industry is 9 times its share of the population. Not because people in Seattle consume more airplanes than the rest of the country. It's because they produce airplanes and export them. Okay, so this is a way to identify what is being produced in a region above what's being consumed in a region. Okay? This flows through to services. So if I include software publishing, Seattle also happens to be the home of Microsoft. we see that Seattle has its share of the software publishing industry's employment is 18 times its share of population overall. So again, it's not because everybody in Seattle is buying a lot of Microsoft products. It's because they produce them there and they ship them around the country and around the world. So we're going to use this insight to identify activities that can be delivered at a distance. They're traded within the United States and thus potentially tradable internationally. When we roll this up, what falls out is, I think, quite clean and very appealing. So what I've shown here is the Gini coefficients of geographic concentration of industries, with the cutoff that we use for what's tradable and what's not tradable. What you see is that just across sectors, the results are very appealing. So agriculture and mining, we think of those as, they're commodities, they're tradable. 100% of employment in agriculture and mining we classify as tradable. In manufacturing, we think most manufactured goods are pretty tradable. We classify 86% of employment in manufacturing as tradable. Those industries that we classify as not tradable in manufacturing, cement, concrete, gypsum, and lime production, structural metal manufacturing, machine shops, and printing shops. So these things either have high weight to value ratios, so they're produced around the country, or they require kind of face-to-face. You've got a print job. You go to your FedEx Kinko's, it's right around the corner. In services, in professional services, we classify a lot of employment, 70% of that sector, in tradable industries. Again, what we classify above and below the line is very intuitively appealing. Software, movies, music production, securities and commodities trading, all highly geographically concentrated, all very tradable. Think about retail banking, pretty ubiquitously distributed around the country. We classify that as non-tradable. Again, we think very appealing. There's more details in the policy brief. I won't belabor it. So when we do this, we can identify what share of the population in the whole workforce is in tradable activities and non-tradable activities. And what we find is that, again, as I said at the beginning, about 40% of employment is in industries that we classify as tradable. In fact, professional services have a bigger slice than manufacturing. So a lot of these service activities are tradable. They're traded within the United States and thus potentially tradable internationally. Okay, so now a lot of this is in play. A lot of jobs are in play. But what's the risk from import competition or contestability? So first we look at, before going to that, a key piece is what do these jobs look like? When we look at tradable services compared to, say, manufacturing, what we see is these are very highly educated people holding these jobs. Workers in tradable services are twice as likely as manufacturing workers to have a college degree and more than twice as likely to have an advanced degree. Highly skilled workforce. And they have very high earnings, even controlling for education, age, gender, experience. We find that workers in tradable industries and tradable occupations have very high earnings, about 20% higher in professional services. So big differentials, big differentials. Highly skilled, highly paid workforce. Some say because these jobs are high wage, that these are the ones we're going to lose to low wage, labor abundant countries. I think this reaction ignores over a century of trade theory, but maybe more importantly, the facts. Okay, so if we look at manufacturing, we think we understand how trade works in manufacturing pretty well. Okay, so if we look at low-wage imports from low-wage countries in manufacturing, what we see is that it's not high-wage manufacturing jobs that are facing competition from low-wage, labor-abundant countries. It's low-wage, labor-intensive industries that are facing competition from low-wage, labor-abundant countries. Okay? The share of imports from low-wage countries falls off rather precipitously as the average earnings in the industry increases. Okay? The one notable outlier is computer and electronic products. I would say that that is a classification problem. If we could somehow disentangle computer assembly, computer and electronics assembly from, say, semiconductor production, what you'd see is that the computer assembly part would move up and to the left. It's low-wage, labor-intensive work. Semiconductors are high-wage and face very little low-wage country competition. Okay, so this pattern is striking. I've put this red line in the policy brief. We talk about this notional threshold for where the U.S. has comparative advantage and where low-wage, labor-abundant countries have comparative advantage. This line will appear repeatedly. So notionally, below 40 grand a year average earnings in the industry, you're likely to face some meaningful level of import competition from low-wage countries. Above it, you probably don't. I'd also like to talk about opportunities from exports. Okay, this is an overlooked, an important component of this dialogue about trade and services and offshoring. Okay, the U.S. is a net exporter of services, and these traded activities seem to be consistent with U.S. comparative advantage. The U.S. exports high-wage, high-skilled manufactured goods, and it exports high-wage, high-skilled service goods. So here's a similar picture. This looks at export intensities in manufacturing. And what we see is that exports per worker rise dramatically as wages in an industry rise. Again, the U.S. has comparative advantage in high-wage, high-skill activities, okay, in manufacturing. In services, the same thing is true. Exports per worker rise dramatically as average wages in an industry rise. Okay, so the U.S. exports high-wage, high-skill activities in goods and services. This is key to understanding the labor market impact of trade and services. Okay, so I'll start talking about the potential impact. And it's this threshold that's key to thinking about this. And this is a key point that I want to emphasize. It's this threshold. Below 40K a year, you're likely to face some low-wage competition, be it from manufactured goods from China or potentially offshoring to India. And what we see is that because tradable services are high-wage jobs, there's just not that much employment in tradable services that's below that 40K threshold. Only about a third of employment in tradable services is below that threshold. This stands in contrast to the manufacturing sector, where 60% of employment is in industries below that threshold. Okay, so and this is it's this threshold that drives our cutting in half or more the estimate of jobs that will face contestability from low-wage markets. Okay, so when we look at, and I'll just cover this very briefly, when we look at impact to date, and there's more on this in the brief, what we see is that tradable service activities have employment growth, whether it's industries or occupations, that's very similar to non-tradable services. In addition, when we look at the median wage change in tradable industries versus non-tradable industries, median wage change is actually higher than non-tradable occupations. When we look at worker displacement rates in tradable services are very low compared to manufacturing, and reemployment rates are higher. Okay, all this suggests that, not to minimize the potential, but to date there has been very little impact on the U.S. economy from offshoring. Okay, so my analytical conclusions: many service activities are tradable. However, we do not expect a large share of tradable service activities to move offshore. These tradable service activities are high-skill, high-wage activities that are consistent with U.S. comparative advantage. We expect the U.S. to gain jobs in high-skill, high-wage services through exporting. So policy implications: the U.S. is well-positioned to export services and should push for services liberalization. Okay. That said, there will be dislocation and cost of dislocation from liberalization. But it'll be low-wage, low-skilled workers that will face continued competitive pressure. Okay? I can see no economic reason to exclude service workers from TAA. You know, they are going to face, these low-wage service workers are going to face increased pressure just like low-wage manufacturing workers have. And it used to be that if you were a low-wage manufacturing worker, you could then look for a job in a low-wage service industry. So that problem is going to be compounded. Assistance should be given to these folks. I hope that our estimates suggest that an expansion of TAA to the service sector will not break the bank. I mean, I think some people think, wow, with services, it's so big, we can't afford it. Hopefully, by properly scoping what the impact will be, it makes this politically feasible. Last, I think there's a continuing role for education and training. We think that we're going to pick up jobs in these high-skill, high-wage activities. We're going to need skilled workers to fill them. So being able to bring people up in terms of education and training is important.